As night settles around Hawthorne Keep, the world grows quiet and still. The last light fades from the stone walls. Shutters are secured, and fires soften into embers. Inside, nothing urgent remains. Life does not stop. It simply slows. This is a quiet story of ordinary people preparing for rest in a long winter season, shaped by familiar routines, shared warmth, and the calm knowledge that the night will pass. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching since today? Simply allow the day to loosen its hold and let the night settle naturally around you. Then, at your own pace, allow the story to drift onward and carry you gently towards sleep. Winter had already tightened its grip on the hills around Hawthorne Keep, and the small market town below the walls was fading into early darkness. Snow lay in quiet drifts along the narrow lanes, and the last carts creaked home with their wheels muffled by slush. Chimney smoke rose in thin, pale lines, then vanished into a low sky that looked like worn linen stretched across the horizon. Up on the ridge, the keep did what it had always done. It held its shape against the weather, and it waited. The night did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, as if the light itself had to decide where to let go first. Over the town roofs, then the fields, then the outer walls, and finally, the inner stone of the courtyard. The grey blocks that formed Hawthorne Keep did not turn darker in a dramatic way. They simply stopped catching what little daylight remained. Inside, people did not go to bed so much as they began to live in a smaller circle. Sarah Hawthorne noticed it in her body before she named it. She was a woman in her early 40s, tall and slim, with a long, quiet posture that made her seem even taller when she stood still. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, was now streaked with soft grey and pulled into a practical knot. Her face was narrow, her cheekbones defined, her mouth set in a neutral line that rarely turned into a smile, but rarely hardened into a frown either. Sarah's eyes were a steady, hazel brown, the kind that rested on details rather than drama. To most people in the keep, Sarah was calm. To those who watched closely, she was careful. Years earlier, she had been a warmer woman. There had been a season when she laughed more easily, when she moved through rooms without counting steps or measuring drafts. But a winter sickness had taken her husband quickly. Too quickly for goodbye, too quickly for preparation. That loss did not make her loud with grief. It made her quiet with responsibility. Since then, Sarah's steadiness had become a habit she trusted. It was how she kept the household moving when the world outside grew indifferent and cold. She stood near a high window, looking down into the courtyard, and watched the last of the daylight thin out. Below, the courtyard stones were already whitening at the edges where snow had blown in. A servant crossed quickly with a bundle of wood, hugged to their chest, head down, shoulders raised against the wind that slipped between the walls. Sarah lifted her hand and drew the curtain closed. The heavy fabric fell into place with a soft, final sound, less like decoration, more like a door. Behind her, the great hall had begun its evening shift. It was the largest room in the keep, and in daylight, it felt almost generous. Long oak tables, benches worn smooth by years, tapestries that softened the stone, and an open hearth whose smoke found its way upward. But at night, the hall became something else. Not threatening, not dramatic, simply colder and more hollow. Ethan Miller stood near the end of a bench, watching the room change in small ways. He was 10 years old, short for his age, with a slight build and narrow shoulders that made his cloak look oversized. His hair was sandy brown and always a little unruly, as if it refused the rules of combs and ribbons. His eyes were a clear grey-blue, observant and thoughtful, and his expression tended to be quiet even when his mind was busy. Ethan was the kind of child who noticed patterns. He noticed that the keep sounded different at night. In the day, there was a steady noise. Voices, footsteps, the scrape of wood, the clink of iron. In the evening, those sounds narrowed down. They became fewer, more distinct. The wind became louder, not because it grew stronger, but because everything else stepped back. Tonight, Ethan listened and felt the difference more sharply than usual. The wind had a tone now, a low, steady thread moving through stone gaps and around shutters. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a storm. It was something quieter, like breathing through a long corridor. Ethan felt it in the way the air touched his cheeks, in the way the candle flames leaned slightly, in the way the hall seemed to hold its silence a little more tightly. He drew his cloak closer and looked down. At his feet lay Rusty. Rusty was an old dog, perhaps 12 or 13 by the counting of years, though nobody had marked his birthday with certainty. He was medium-sized with a broad chest and a thick coat that used to be a bright, warm red-brown, but had dulled with age into a softer copper, especially along his back. His muzzle was grey now, and his ears, once quick to lift at every sound, moved more slowly. His eyes were dark and gentle, and there was a patience in him that felt like the patience of winter itself. Rusty had a habit of choosing his warmth wisely. He did not rush. He did not beg. He simply paid attention to where the heat would be and placed himself there, as if he belonged to the fire as much as to the people. Ethan had grown up with Rusty in the background of every season. Rusty had been there when Ethan learned to walk across cold stone without slipping. Rusty had been there when Ethan cried at night from a fever, when the dog's body leaned against him like a quiet reassurance. Rusty was not clever in the way of tricks, but he was loyal in the way that mattered. Steady, present, and calm. As the light faded further, Rusty lifted his head, sniffed once, and rose. His joints protested a little. Ethan could hear the soft sound of movement, the slow effort of an older body. Rusty padded toward the hearth without hesitation. He circled twice, testing the floor with his paws, then settled down close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close that sparks might land on his fur. He curled his body inward, nose tucked toward his tail, a living knot of heat-saving instinct. Ethan followed with his eyes and felt a small, familiar comfort. Across the hall, another figure moved with practiced quiet. Margaret Hawthorne entered from a side passage, her steps measured and careful. She was older than Sarah, late 60s perhaps, shorter and slightly stooped, but not fragile. Margaret had the kind of strength that came from years of managing a household, through seasons that did not forgive mistakes. Her hair was silver and worn in a neat braid wrapped around the back of her head. Her face was lined, but her eyes remained sharp, dark grey and attentive, like polished stone. Margaret's presence carried a gentle authority. She did not raise her voice often. She did not need to. People tended to notice her because she noticed everything. A window that hadn't been fully shuttered. A bench left out of place. A child's collar open to draft. Tonight, Margaret moved straight to the tall windows on the hall's western side. Without speaking, she reached for the curtain cord and pulled. The fabric slid closed earlier than usual, sealing out the last thin stripe of dusk. It wasn't fear that made her do it. It was experience. Margaret had lived through enough winters to understand that the smallest decisions mattered. A curtain drawn 5 minutes earlier meant a fraction less cold settling into the room. Over hours, those fractions became comfort. Sarah glanced toward Margaret and gave a small nod. It was not a conversation, but it was acknowledgement. Two women who understood the same language of winter. Quiet, practical, and precise. Ethan watched Margaret and felt the way her choices shaped the room. The hall seemed more enclosed now, less open to the outside world. The air changed slightly, as if it had been told to stay. The keep was narrowing, not because anything dramatic happened, but because this was what people did when the cold deepened. On the far side of the hall, servants began to shift benches closer to the walls. The heavy tables were no longer needed. A few were cleared, leaving open floor space. Straw pallets, thin and plain, were carried in, unrolled, and placed in familiar patterns that had been repeated hundreds of nights. No one announced, "It is time to sleep." Sleep arrived like the dark did, gradually, quietly, without ceremony. Ethan moved toward the area where his pallet would be laid. He did not complain about it. He had never known another arrangement. Still, he felt the cold through the soles of his shoes, especially near the edges of the hall, where stone held the memory of the day's low temperature. He hesitated for a moment, listening. The wind again. It was different now. Not louder, just closer, as if the keep itself had shifted, and the sound had found a better path through a crack somewhere high above. Ethan tried to imagine where it entered, through an arrow slit, through a poorly sealed shutter, through a gap in mortar, the way water found a path through rock. His curiosity did not feel urgent. It felt sleepy. That was the strange thing about night in Hawthorne Keep. The keep did not invite excitement. It invited attention, then quiet. Margaret passed near Ethan and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Light pressure, a small check. Her touch was cool, her palm firm. "You're listening too hard," she said softly, not unkindly. Ethan looked up at her. "I think the wind sounds different," he whispered, as if speaking louder might disturb something. Margaret's eyes softened just a little. "It always does," she said. "In the day, everything else talks over it." Ethan considered that. He looked toward the hearth, where the fire was beginning to settle lower. He watched Rusty shift slightly, nose tucked tighter. He watched Sarah standing near the edge of the room, still and steady, as if she belonged to the keep as much as the stone itself. The hall was becoming a smaller world. Curtains drawn, doors closed, voices reduced, movements slower. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the town below, softening every edge, making the world quiet enough that even distance felt close. Inside Hawthorne Keep, the night did what it always did. It narrowed life down to what mattered: warmth, shelter, and the quiet presence of others. Rusty had found his place by the fire. Margaret had drawn the curtains early. And Ethan, listening to the wind, began to understand that night did not change the keep. It simply revealed what the keep already was. The keep had fully settled into night. What little warmth remained from the day no longer lingered in the air, but seemed to have slipped somewhere deeper, or into places no one could reach. The great hall felt quieter than before, not because people had stopped moving entirely, but because every movement now carried weight. Each step on stone echoed longer. Each breath felt more noticeable, as if the air itself had thickened. The walls did not change colour. They did not frost over dramatically. They simply remained what they had always been: stone, grey, and patient, holding more than they revealed. Ethan Miller lay on his pallet, wrapped in his cloak, staring upward. The ceiling beams disappeared into shadow above him. He could feel the cold rising from the floor, seeping slowly through straw, through fabric, through layers meant to slow it down. It wasn't painful. It was persistent, like a thought that refused to leave once it had arrived. He shifted slightly, trying to find a position where less of his body touched the ground. Nearby, Rusty breathed steadily, the sound slow and deep. The dog had not moved far from the hearth, but even there the warmth was modest, a suggestion rather than a solution. Ethan's fingers brushed the stone beside his pallet as he adjusted the edge of his cloak. The surface was colder than he expected. Not icy, just deeply, unmistakably cold. He pulled his hand back and frowned. That was when he heard the voice. Still awake, Ethan turned his head toward the sound. Near one of the inner walls sat Thomas Reed, wrapped in a thick wool coat, his back resting against the stone, as if he belonged there. He was an old man, older than Margaret, older than most, perhaps in his 70s. His body was thin but wiry, shaped by decades of physical labor. His hands were large and knotted, fingers permanently curved from years of gripping tools. His beard was white and uneven, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, and his hair had thinned enough that his cap sat low on his forehead to keep warmth in. Thomas Reed was the keep's stonemason. He had worked on Hawthorne Keep longer than anyone could remember clearly. Some said he had helped repair sections of the outer wall after a collapse years ago. Others said his father had worked the same stone before him. Thomas himself never corrected anyone. He seemed content to exist alongside the keep, rather than inside its stories. Ethan nodded slightly. "The floor feels colder tonight." Thomas smiled, though it was a small smile, barely lifting one corner of his mouth. "It does that," he said, "once the sun's gone for good." He reached out and placed his palm flat against the wall beside him. He did not flinch or pull away. His skin rested there as naturally as if he were touching wood. Stone remembers, Thomas continued, his voice low and steady. People think it just sits there, but it listens. It keeps things. Ethan pushed himself up on one elbow, curious. Keeps what? Cold, Thomas said simply. Heat too, if you're lucky enough to have it long enough. But mostly cold, especially after winters like this. Ethan looked at the wall again. In the dim light, it looked solid, unchanging. He had never thought of it as something that could remember. It doesn't forget the night, Thomas added, not the way people do. As he spoke, a sound moved through the hall, a long, thin whistle that rose and fell. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet in a way that made Ethan's shoulders tense. Thomas tilted his head slightly. There, he said. That's one of the old seams. Ethan listened. The sound seemed to come from somewhere above, maybe where two sections of stone met. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a gust. It was closer to a breath drawn through narrow lips. A crack? Ethan asked. A seam, Thomas corrected gently. Older than you. Older than me. Stone shifts, even when it looks still. That gap lets the wind remember how to get in. Ethan swallowed. The sound wasn't frightening exactly, but it made the keep feel less sealed, less complete. Across the hall, Sarah Hawthorne sat on a bench near the wall, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She had not lain down yet. She often waited until the hall fully settled, until everyone else had found their place. It was another habit shaped by loss and responsibility, one she did not question anymore. She felt the cold radiating from the stone behind her, through her layers of wool and linen. It was familiar. She leaned forward slightly, reducing the surface of her body pressed against the wall. Small adjustments like that mattered over hours. Margaret Hawthorne moved quietly along the inner edge of the hall, checking shutters with a practiced eye. She paused at one narrow opening high above the floor, listening to the same thin whistle Ethan had noticed. Her lips pressed together. That seam's widening, she murmured, mostly to herself. Thomas heard her and nodded once. Has been for years. Not enough to fail. Just enough to speak. Margaret did not argue. She trusted Thomas's sense of stone, the way sailors trusted the sea by smell and sound. The fire in the hearth shifted. A log settled, sending a brief scatter of sparks upward before the flames calmed again. The warmth reached only a short distance before being absorbed, pulled away into the walls and floor, as if the keep were drinking it. Ethan lay back down, pulling his cloak tighter. He imagined the walls as enormous hands, holding on to every cold night that had ever passed through them. He wondered how many winters they remembered, how many people had leaned against them, seeking the same small comfort. The sound of the seam returned, steady now. It made the night feel longer. Thomas eventually rose, his joints protesting softly. He placed one hand on the wall again before moving away, as if checking on an old companion. Then he shuffled toward his pallet, settling down with careful movements. Sleep when you can, he said to Ethan. Stone doesn't mind if you don't. It'll be here either way. Ethan nodded, though his eyes were already growing heavy. The cold did not push him away from sleep. It pulled him toward it, encouraging stillness. Around the hall, breathing deepened. Bodies curled inward. Cloaks shifted. No one spoke. The keep held its memory of winter close. And the people within it did what they had always done. They rested where they could, knowing the walls would remember the cold long after morning came. The fire was still alive, but no one expected it to do more than it already had. Its flames were smaller now, lower than they had been in the early evening, no longer reaching upward with any ambition. They stayed close to the logs, moving slowly, as if conserving their own strength. The warmth it offered was real, but contained, held within a narrow circle that ended only a few steps away from the hearth. Beyond that invisible boundary, the air remained unchanged. Cool, dense, and patient. People understood this without speaking. No one arranged themselves as if the fire would expand. No one trusted it to last without attention. Samuel Brooks sat on a low stool near the hearth, his back slightly hunched, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He was a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, with narrow shoulders and a body lean from long days of work rather than strength. His hair was dark and cut short, uneven at the edges where he had trimmed it himself. His face carried a permanent look of quiet focus, his eyes deep-set and observant, as if he were always watching something just below the surface of things. Samuel was the fire watcher. It was not a title given with ceremony. It was simply a role that had fallen to him after years of proving that he could stay awake when others could not, that he noticed changes before they became problems. He did not talk much, not because he was shy, but because he had learned that fires responded better to attention than to words. He was not watching the flames. His eyes rested on the bed of coals beneath them. They glowed a deep, steady red, brighter in some places, dimmer in others. Samuel could tell more from that than from any dancing flame above. Flames lied. They flared suddenly, vanished just as quickly, gave the impression of strength even when the heat was already fading. Coals did not pretend. They told the truth slowly. A log shifted slightly as part of it burned through. Samuel leaned forward, adjusted it with the iron poker, careful not to scatter ash too widely. He did not add wood. Not yet. He knew better. Near the edge of the hall, Ethan stirred, half awake. The firelight reflected faintly on the stone ceiling, a dull orange that never reached far. Ethan watched Samuel's movements for a moment, fascinated by how deliberate they were. There was no urgency in them, no rush, just timing. Sarah Hawthorne lay on her side now, her cloak pulled high around her shoulders. She had moved closer to the warmth earlier, but stopped well short of the hearth. Experience had taught her that getting too warm too early made the cold feel sharper later. She preferred consistency, even if it meant less comfort. She noticed Samuel's stillness. Some people filled silence with movement. Samuel did the opposite. When he stopped, it meant he was listening. Not to the fire, but to the room around it, to the subtle shifts of air, to the way cold crept back when the fire weakened. Margaret Hawthorne watched him from across the hall. She had seen many men tend fires over the years. Most of them stared directly into the flames, feeding them too often, mistaking brightness for stability. Those fires burned hot and fast, leaving nothing but ash before morning. Samuel did not make that mistake. Against the wall near the hearth, Rusty lay with his head on his paws, his muzzle resting just beyond the warm edge. His coat caught the light, the grey around his face more pronounced than before. He lifted his head slightly when Samuel moved, then settled again, satisfied. The night continued to deepen. Outside, wind pressed against the keep. Not violently, but persistently. It found the same seams Thomas had spoken of earlier, slipping through stone joints that no one could seal without rebuilding the walls themselves. The sound was lower now, more distant, as if the wind too had settled into routine. Samuel reached behind him and touched the small stack of firewood set against the wall. He did not look at it directly. He knew exactly how much remained. How many logs, how dry they were, how long each would burn if used correctly. One bundle was set apart from the rest, bound tightly with twine. That wood was not for now. It was for the hour before dawn. Samuel had learned this the hard way his first winter. He had fed the fire generously through the early night, responding to the cold with enthusiasm rather than patience. By morning, the hearth had been nothing but pale ash, and the hall had woken colder than it had slept. Margaret had not scolded him. She had simply shown him the empty wood rack. Since then, Samuel treated fire as a resource to be stretched, not a force to be unleashed. He waited. Time passed in a way that was difficult to measure. No bells rang. No voices marked the hours. Only the slow dimming and brightening of coals as Samuel adjusted them told him when attention was needed. Ethan drifted back towards sleep, the glow of the hearth blurring behind his eyes. The cold pressed in again, but gently, like a reminder rather than a threat. He pulled his knees closer to his chest, reducing the space where warmth could escape. Across the hall, a cat emerged from the shadows near one of the storage alcoves. She was small and slender, her fur dark with faint streaks of brown, her movements precise and soundless. Her name was Willow, though no one could remember who had named her first. She was not young anymore, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, but she moved with practiced ease, jumping lightly onto a low bench near the hearth. Willow did not approach the fire directly. Like Sarah, she understood limits. She curled her tail around her body and closed her eyes, positioning herself where warmth reached without overwhelming. Her ears twitched once at a settling log, then stilled. Samuel noticed her briefly and allowed himself a small smile. Animals learned faster than people. The fire dipped slightly, the glow of the coals dimming at the edges. Samuel rose quietly, added a single piece of wood, not large, not small, placing it carefully so it would catch slowly. He watched until the flame responded, then stepped back. He did not stay standing. He returned to his stool, conserving his own energy as carefully as he conserved the fire's. Fire was not hope. Hope suggested change. Fire only postponed what was already waiting. Everyone in Hawthorne Keep understood this. whether they had words for it or not. The stone would reclaim the warmth eventually. The cold would return in full measure. The fire's purpose was not to win, but to slow the loss long enough for sleep to happen. And so Samuel waited, eyes on the coals, hands still, breath slow. The reserved bundle of wood remained untouched. Morning was still far away. The night did not announce itself anymore. It had already settled fully into Hawthorne Keep, pressing gently but firmly against every surface. Inside, the great hall moved into its next familiar phase. Not silence, but preparation, and no one spoke of going to sleep. They simply began doing the things that always came before it. Pallets were unrolled along the edges of the hall, their straw flattened thin from years of use. Benches were shifted away from the central space and turned lengthwise to serve as narrow beds. A few stools were stacked against the wall, out of the way, their legs scraping softly across stone. The sound carried farther now than it had earlier in the evening, but no one seemed bothered by it. These noises were part of the pattern. They signaled that the day had finished narrowing itself down to what was necessary. Anna Miller knelt beside a pallet near the inner wall, folding a wool blanket with careful precision. She was a woman in her early 30s, of average height and build, her body shaped more by endurance than softness. Her hair, once lighter, had darkened over the years and was pulled back tightly to keep it from falling loose while she worked. Her face was plain but steady, marked by faint lines around the eyes that came not from smiling often, but from watching closely. There was a quiet restraint in her movements, as if she preferred not to take up more space than required. She folded the blanket the same way every night, once lengthwise, then twice across, smoothing the fabric with her palms before setting it at the foot of the pallet. It was not a habit she questioned. She had learned it from her own mother long ago. During winters that felt much the same as this one, folding the blanket properly meant it would unroll evenly later, without gaps. Gaps let cold in. Ethan watched her from where he sat, already wrapped in his cloak. He knew the rhythm of her movements well. When she finished, she adjusted the edge of the straw beneath, then reached for another layer. "Not too close to the wall," she said quietly, not looking up. "I know," Ethan replied, shifting a few inches inward. The inner wall was colder than most. It held less draft than the outer stones, but the cold it radiated was deeper, slower to fade. Anna had learned to judge distance by feel rather than sight. Across the hall, 2 young servants worked quickly, laying out their pallets side by side. They were both new to the keep, barely past adolescence, their bodies still awkward with growth. One was tall and narrow, his limbs long and restless. The other was shorter and broader, his movements heavier, less precise. Neither spoke above a whisper, but their glances toward the wall were frequent. "That spot's warmer," the taller one murmured, nodding toward the inner stone. "It's less draft," the other replied. "Thomas said so." They edged their pallets closer together, each trying to claim the position with the least wind. Their competition was quiet, without anger. It was understood. No one wanted to sleep where the air moved too freely. Sarah Hawthorne moved among them briefly, her presence steady and unintrusive. She did not give instructions unless they were needed. Years of managing the keep through seasons like this had taught her that people slept better when allowed to arrange themselves. Order mattered, but so did familiarity. Near the far end of the hall, heavy bed curtains were drawn around one of the larger frames reserved for guests and family. The fabric was thick and dark, worn smooth where hands had pulled it closed night after night. Inside that small enclosed space, the air would warm gradually, held in place by layers of wool and the steady breath of those within. Margaret Hawthorne checked the overlap of the curtains, ensuring no narrow opening remained. She tugged once more at the edge, then nodded to herself. A poorly closed curtain invited drafts. Drafts disrupted sleep. Sleep, in winter, was not guaranteed. The fire continued its slow, managed burn behind them. Samuel remained on his stool, eyes on the coals, adjusting nothing unless necessary. The light it cast softened the edges of the room, but it did not reach the corners where pallets were now being claimed. That was expected. Rusty shifted his position slightly, turning in a slow circle before lowering himself again. His joints moved stiffly, protesting the change, but he did not make a sound. He chose a spot where warmth brushed his side without reaching his face. Experience guided him as surely as instinct. Willow watched the activity from her bench, eyes half closed. She flicked her tail once when one of the young servants passed too close, then settled again, unbothered. She would move later, when the hall was still and the air had settled into its coldest pattern. Anna finished arranging Ethan's pallet and placed a small rolled cloth near his head, a makeshift pillow. She did not kiss him or speak further. That was not how nights were handled here. Instead, she rested her hand briefly on his shoulder. A moment of contact, then gone. She moved to her own place nearby and repeated the same process. Blanket folded, straw adjusted, cloak laid within reach. Her movements were economical, conserving energy. Nothing was done in excess. The benches were now fully occupied. A few men lay down without ceremony, boots still on, caps pulled low. Others remained seated for a moment longer, stretching fingers or rubbing warmth back into hands before committing to stillness. The hall began to quiet, not suddenly, but in stages. Fabric rustled less, breathing deepened. The soft scrape of movement gave way to the heavier sound of bodies settling. No prayers were spoken aloud. No signals were given. The keep did not require ritual to mark this transition. Repetition was enough. Anna lay on her side, facing inward. She tucked her knees slightly, drawing her cloak closer. She thought briefly of the blankets folded earlier, of how many winters she had done this same sequence of motions. The memory did not trouble her. There was comfort in knowing exactly what came next. The two young servants finally stopped adjusting their pallets. One whispered something too low to hear. The other gave a short, breathless laugh, then turned onto his side. Their competition ended not with victory, but with acceptance. Margaret extinguished the last lamp near the hall's edge, plunging that corner into deeper shadow. The firelight remained, dull and steady. Samuel did not look up. The preparations were complete. Sleep, such as it could be, would follow. By the time the hall finally settled into stillness, everyone inside Hawthorne Keep was already wearing what they would sleep in. There was no moment when clothes were removed or set aside for mourning. Winter did not allow for that separation. What people wore through the day simply became what they wore through the night, with additional layers added as needed, each one chosen for function rather than comfort. Ethan felt the weight of it first. He lay on his pallet, cloak drawn tight, linen shirt tucked beneath wool, trousers still fastened, socks pulled high. The layers pressed against him in a way that felt unfamiliar. During the day, clothing shifted and breathed with movement. Now, lying still, the fabric gathered and held its shape, creating small pockets of warmth and stiffness at the same time. Anna Miller noticed him shifting and reached for something beside her pallet. It was a wool cap, thick and plain, knitted years earlier by hands no one remembered clearly anymore. The yarn had softened with age, the edges slightly misshapen, but it was dense enough to hold heat where it mattered most. "Here," she said quietly, lifting his head just enough to slide it on. Ethan froze as the cap settled over his hair and ears. He had never slept with a cap before. The sensation was strange at first. The pressure around his temples, the way sound changed slightly, muffled by wool. His ears felt warmer almost immediately, and with that warmth came a faint sense of safety he hadn't expected. "It'll feel odd," Anna said, already lowering his head back onto the pallet. "Give it a moment." Anna herself wore multiple layers, though none of them were new. A thin linen shift closest to her skin, then a wool dress darkened by years of washing, then a cloak she folded around herself carefully before lying down. She did not complain about the stiffness or the weight. Comfort, to her, had become secondary long ago. What mattered was whether the layers worked. She had learned that lesson during her first winter as a mother, when illness had kept Ethan awake night after night, holding him close, wrapped in borrowed cloaks. She had understood then that warmth came from accumulation, not softness. Across the hall, Margaret Hawthorne adjusted her own coat before settling down. It was an old garment, heavier than most, the wool worn thin at the elbows and collar, the lining repaired more than once. She had owned it for decades, long enough that the fabric no longer held its original color. Margaret noticed Ethan watching and paused. "This coat," she said softly, patting the sleeve, "knows the cold." Her voice carried a faint trace of humor, but it wasn't a joke. "I've tried replacing it," she continued, settling back against the wall. "New ones look finer, sit straighter, but they don't work the same. This one's learned how winter behaves." Ethan considered that, touching the edge of his wool cap. He wondered if clothing could truly learn, or if it was the people inside them who did the remembering. Sarah Hawthorne listened without turning her head. She lay a short distance away, her posture precise even in rest. Her layers were arranged with care. Linen beneath wool, cloak pulled close, boots loosened but not removed. She had learned to keep her feet protected at all hours. Cold entered the body easily through the ground. Sarah did not wear excess. She wore enough. Years ago, in the winter when her husband had fallen ill, She had spent long nights sitting upright beside his bed, wrapped in layers that allowed her to stay awake without shivering. That winter had taught her that warmth was something to be managed deliberately. Too much led to sweat, which turned dangerous as soon as movement stopped. Too little invited exhaustion. Balance mattered. Nearby, the two young servants lay side by side, wrapped in whatever garments they owned between them. One had pulled his coat over his head entirely, leaving only his nose exposed. The other wore two caps stacked together, their shapes uneven but effective. Neither looked comfortable, but both had stopped shifting. That was a sign the layers were working. Rusty lifted his head briefly when the room grew quieter, then tucked his nose beneath his tail again. His coat was thick enough that additional covering wasn't needed, but age had thinned his warmth from the inside. He pressed closer to the faint heat of the hearth, paws drawn in tight. Willow moved at last, stepping lightly down from the bench and crossing the stone floor with careful precision. She paused near Margaret's coat, then curled herself into the hollow created by its drape. The wool trapped warmth in a way she recognized. She did not need or adjust. She simply settled, eyes closing at once. Samuel Brooks shifted on his stool, pulling his own coat tighter as the fire dipped slightly. He did not add wood. He trusted the layers on his body the same way he trusted the coals. His coat was thinner than Margaret's, patched at the seams, but he wore a scarf wound twice around his neck and tucked into his shirt. His hands rested inside his sleeves, conserving heat. He had learned early on that fingers lost warmth faster than any other part of the body. Once numb, they were slow to recover. The hall held a quiet uniformity now. Dark shapes against darker stone, fabric overlapping fabric, breath slowing. Ethan flexed his toes inside his socks and boots, feeling the faint resistance of leather. He wondered briefly what it would feel like to sleep without clothes, free and light, the way summer allowed. The thought faded quickly. Even imagining it made the cold feel sharper. Instead, he focused on the warmth gathering beneath his layers. The cap held heat close to his scalp. His cloak reduced the draft that slipped along the floor. The straw beneath him insulated just enough to slow the stone's pull. He stopped shifting. Margaret adjusted her coat collar and lay still, eyes open for a moment longer. She remembered a winter from her youth, when she had owned only one thin wrap, and learned too late that pride offered no insulation. That lesson had stayed with her longer than any garment. Since then, she had chosen function without apology. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the way her breathing matched the slow rhythm of the hall. She noted the absence of movement, the way the layers around her had reached equilibrium. That was the goal. Not warmth exactly, but steadiness. No one spoke. Clothing rustled once or twice as someone settled more deeply. Then even that faded. The keep did not grow warmer, but inside the layers, within the careful stacking of fabric and habit, people found enough heat to rest. Once the layers had settled and the hall found its quiet balance, the beds revealed their true purpose. They were not objects meant for comfort or display. They were shelters, assembled each night from habit and necessity, shaped less by design than by experience. In Hawthorne Keep, Her bed did not promise rest. It offered protection. The curtained frames along the inner wall were drawn closed one by one, the heavy fabric falling into place with a sound softer than footsteps. Inside those enclosures, the air immediately changed. It grew stiller, contained, as if the space itself had learned to hold on. A room formed within a room, modest and temporary, existing only until morning loosened its grip. Ethan lay on his pallet near one of the frames, watching the movement of curtains with drowsy curiosity. The wool cap still covered his ears, dulling the sounds of the hall, and the layers around him had reached that moment when warmth stopped shifting and began to stay. He could feel his breath now, slow, measured, touching the air in front of his face before drifting away. Anna Miller reached for the edge of the curtain nearest him and drew it partly closed, leaving a narrow opening. She did not seal it completely. Too little air made the space damp too quickly. Too much invited drafts. Balance again. Always balance. Anna was careful with such details. She was a woman who had learned through long nights that small choices compounded over hours. She lay down and faced inward, the curtain forming a boundary that reduced the hall to a muffled presence beyond. Inside, the space felt smaller but safer. The fabric hung close enough that Ethan's breath brushed it as he exhaled. At first, the sensation surprised him. He watched the cloth darken in tiny patches where moisture gathered, then fade slightly as the warmth redistributed. His breathing slowed without effort, guided by the quiet of the enclosed air. He had never thought of a bed this way before. Not as something to lie on, but something to be inside. Across the hall, Sarah Hawthorne adjusted the curtains around her own frame with practiced hands. She drew them closed fully, then reopened a narrow gap near the top, allowing warm air to circulate upward without escaping too quickly. Her movements were precise, economical. Years earlier, when she had first learned these habits, she had done so under the strain of illness and loss. Now they came without thought, a language her body spoke fluently. Inside her curtained space, the air warmed gradually. Sarah felt it in the loosening of her shoulders, in the way the cold receded from her hands. She rested her palm briefly against the fabric, gauging thickness, then withdrew it. The curtain did its work best when left alone. Near the hearth, Margaret Hawthorne settled into her own enclosure. Her frame was older. The wood darkened and worn smooth where hands had touched it for decades. The curtains were heavier here, lined with a second layer stitched on long ago. Margaret pulled them closed with care, ensuring the overlap was complete. She knew what happened when it wasn't. Within moments, her breath began to alter the space. The air grew warmer, more humid. She could feel it against her cheeks. It reminded her of mornings long past, waking to find the curtain stiff to the touch, its surface kissed by frost, where warmth had met cold stone. That memory did not trouble her. It reassured her. Rusty shifted again, settling closer to the base of one frame, where warmth pooled gently. He did not enter the enclosure fully. He preferred the edge, where heat gathered without enclosing him. His breath was steady now, each exhale slow and deep. The years had taught him where comfort ended and rest began. Willow remained curled near Margaret's coat, but she too felt the change. She rose, crossed silently, and slipped beneath the lower edge of the curtain, choosing the protected air inside. She turned once, then twice, before folding herself into a tight circle. Her fur caught the warmth quickly. Samuel Brooks remained outside the curtained spaces, the fire watcher by necessity. He pulled his coat tighter and shifted his stool closer to the hearth, though not close enough to interfere with airflow. He understood that enclosed spaces trapped warmth, but fires needed openness. His role existed in the in-between. The fire's glow reflected faintly on the outer curtains, a soft flicker that did not penetrate inside. That was intentional. Light was not needed there, only warmth. Ethan's eyes grew heavy as the enclosed air settled. He noticed how the hall's sounds had changed. The wind's low whisper faded into something distant. Footsteps no longer echoed. Even the fire seemed quieter, its crackle softened by fabric and stillness. His breath continued to brush the curtain, darkening it slightly with moisture. The cloth responded, holding warmth close, then releasing it back into the small space. The cycle repeated, gentle and unremarkable. Anna lay awake a moment longer, listening. She could tell when Ethan's breathing shifted from awareness to rest. She did not move to check on him. That would disturb the balance. Instead, she adjusted her own position slightly, knees drawn in, conserving heat. In the hours that followed, the curtained beds did what stone walls could not. They created pockets of livable warmth within an unforgiving structure. The keep remembered the cold, but inside the fabric enclosures, people built something temporary and sufficient. Time passed without markers. Later, long before morning announced itself, Anna stirred. She did not wake fully. Her hand reached out instinctively and brushed the curtain beside her. The fabric felt stiff beneath her fingers, a thin layer of ice forming where warm breath had met cold air beyond. She did not pull her hand back quickly. She pressed once, feeling the boundary between warmth and winter. Yes, she thought, it is holding. She withdrew her hand and settled again, satisfied. The bed did not promise comfort. It promised survival. And for this night, that was enough. By the time the curtained beds had settled into their small breathing pockets of warmth, the hall had become a map of closeness. People did not choose distance anymore. Distance belonged to daylight. Night asked for something else. In Hawthorne Keep, no one slept alone if there was any way to avoid it. Warmth, like work and memory, was shared. Ethan felt the shift first at his feet. Rusty moved without sound, his old body careful not to disturb the narrow space. He pressed himself along Ethan's legs, settling with his spine aligned to the boy's shins, paws tucked beneath his chest. The dog's coat was thick but uneven now, warmed in places and thin in others, and the heat from his body spread slowly, deliberately. Ethan did not stir at first. His breathing had already fallen into a deeper rhythm. But when the warmth reached him, he sighed, a small, unconscious sound, and curled his knees just enough to meet it. Rusty stayed there, steady as stone. His head turned slightly, so his breath warmed the air beneath the curtain, without dampening it too quickly. He had learned this through years of winter nights. Too much moisture invited chill. Enough warmth invited rest. Across the hall, two figures shifted together under a shared blanket. Clara and June, the young servant sisters, lay on the same pallet with practiced coordination. Clara was the older by a few years, taller, with a sturdy build that suggested she would grow strong with time. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her jaw set even in sleep. She had learned to take responsibility early, long before she arrived at the keep. June, smaller and quieter, fit against her side like a careful echo. Her hair fell loose more easily, and her hand sought warmth instinctively. Fingers curling into fabric or sleeve, they slept back to back, spines touching, sharing heat without needing to face one another. It was not intimacy in the sentimental sense. It was efficiency. They had tried sleeping apart during their first weeks at Hawthorne Keep and learned quickly how much colder the night became when bodies did not cooperate. "Move closer," Clara murmured once. Half awake, June did, shifting until the blanket sealed properly around them. Then both grew still. Sarah Hawthorne lay within her curtained frame, aware of the subtle changes happening beyond the fabric. She had not always liked sleeping close to others. In her younger years, she had preferred space, order, a sense of personal boundary. But winter had taught her a different lesson, reinforced the hard way. When her husband had been ill, warmth had come not from distance, but from proximity, sitting close through long nights, sharing heat, sharing breath. Those hours had shaped her understanding of survival. Now, she did not resist closeness. She planned for it. She had positioned her frame deliberately, close enough to others that the ambient warmth of the hall pooled there slightly more than elsewhere. The keep was not generous with heat, but it did respond to concentration. Where people gathered, the air changed. Margaret Hawthorne understood this instinctively. She had slept in every arrangement imaginable over her many winters. Alone, with children, with others who needed warmth more than privacy. She now lay within her heavier curtains, one arm resting against the fabric where Willow pressed from the inside. The cat's small body radiated a surprising amount of heat, concentrated and persistent. Margaret shifted her hand slightly, allowing Willow more space. She smiled faintly in the dark. Animals, she thought, never argued with necessity. Near the hearth, Samuel Brooks remained seated, his role keeping him just outside the web of shared bodies. Still, he was not alone. The warmth from others reached him indirectly, carried through layers of air and stone. He adjusted his scarf and leaned his shoulder briefly against a post warmed by proximity. It was not much, but it was enough. He had learned long ago that solitude in winter was dangerous, not because it brought fear, but because it allowed cold to settle, unchallenged. Along the inner wall, one of the younger men shifted closer to another without comment. Their boots touched, their shoulders brushed. No one apologized. The night did not require manners, only sense. Ethan stirred slightly. waking just enough to register the pressure at his legs. He opened his eyes a fraction. The world beyond the curtain blurred and dim. Rusty's presence grounded him. He reached down without thinking and rested his hand against the dog's shoulder. The fur was warm and familiar. The steady rise and fall of Rusty's breathing matched his own within moments. He slept deeper then. The hall's temperature did not rise, not in any measurable way. The stone walls still radiated cold. The floor remained unforgiving. But between bodies, beneath blankets, within shared space, warmth lingered longer than it would have alone. Margaret recalled a winter from her youth, one of the coldest she could remember. She had been a child then, sleeping in a crowded room with cousins and siblings, limbs tangled, breath shared. There had been complaints at first. Elbows, hair, the closeness. But by morning, those who had slept nearest each other had woken rested. Those who had kept distance had not. She had never forgotten that lesson. Anna Miller lay on her side, facing Ethan and Rusty. She listened to their breathing, counting without counting. Letting the sound reassure her, she adjusted her own position slightly, aligning herself closer, allowing the shared warmth to settle across her chest and arms. Motherhood had changed her understanding of space. She no longer measured comfort by room, but by presence. Outside the curtains, the wind pressed again against the keep. It found the same old seams and whispered through them, patient and untroubled. Inside, the sound softened as fabric and bodies absorbed it. Willow shifted, stretching once, then curling tighter. Her tail brushed Margaret's wrist, then stilled. She purred softly, not loud enough to carry, just enough to vibrate warmth into the space. Samuel glanced toward the reserved bundle of wood by the hearth, and then back to the coals. He did not move. He knew that the warmth people shared now mattered more than anything he could add with fire at this hour. The fire's role would come later. The night continued, long, uneven. In Hawthorne Keep, survival did not come from isolation or strength alone. It came from alignment. Bodies angled toward one another. Breath shared. Heat conserved through closeness. No one spoke of it. They simply slept nearer. The night did not move forward in a straight line. It folded back on itself, paused, then continued again. Inside Hawthorne Keep, sleep arrived in pieces rather than as a single, unbroken thing. There were no bells to mark the hours, no lamps to announce a change. Only the body knew when it was time to surface briefly, and when it was safe to sink back down. Ethan woke without opening his eyes. At first, he did not know why. There was no noise sharp enough to demand attention, no cold sudden enough to force movement. Instead, it was a subtle shift. His breathing felt different, lighter, as if the room around him had changed shape. The wool cap still held warmth around his ears, and Rusty's body pressed against his legs. Steady and familiar. The curtain breathed softly with each exhale, dampened now in places where moisture had settled and then cooled. He listened. The hall beyond the curtain existed only as a presence, not a picture. Somewhere, the fire made a low sound as embers shifted. Far above, The wind traced its old path through stone seams, quieter than before. Ethan's body did not ask him to rise. It simply asked him to notice. Beside him, Anna Miller was awake. She lay still, careful not to disturb the balance of warmth within the enclosure. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing, her hands folded together near her chest. Anna was not a woman given to outward displays of faith or fear. Her life had taught her to keep both private. But in these hours, when the night stretched longest and the body hovered between states, her thoughts often found their way into words, spoken too softly to carry far. Ethan heard her then, barely more than breath. Not a sentence, not a request, a rhythm. It took him a moment to recognize it as prayer, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was stripped of ceremony. There were no names spoken aloud, no formal endings, just fragments shaped by habit and need, gratitude for warmth held, hope for morning, a quiet asking for nothing to worsen before dawn. Ethan did not interrupt. He did not move. He allowed the sound to pass through him the way the cold passed through stone. Present, acknowledged, but not alarming. After a while, Anna's whisper faded back into silence. Her breathing deepened again, the body accepting rest once more. Ethan followed. Elsewhere in the hall, Samuel Brooks shifted on his stool. He had not slept. He never did during these hours. His role placed him outside the rhythm of broken sleep, but he understood it well. He could feel the moment when the hall collectively stirred, when bodies adjusted, when breath patterns changed. It was the coldest part of the night approaching, when the fire needed attention not to grow, but to endure. Samuel rose quietly, joints stiff from stillness rather than age. He moved toward the hearth without hurry, the way one moved when sound mattered. The coals glowed low now, a deep red barely visible beneath a thin layer of ash. He did not add a large log. Instead, he selected a small piece of wood from the pile. Dry, narrow, unremarkable. He placed it carefully among the coals, not on top of them. The wood did not flame. It darkened, then slowly began to glow, feeding the embers without producing light that would disrupt the sleeping hall. Samuel watched, counting breaths rather than seconds. The coals responded as he expected. Their glow strengthened just enough to hold. Heat radiated outward again, modest and contained. Fire was not meant to wake anyone. It was meant to prevent the cold from advancing unchecked. Satisfied, Samuel returned to his stool and sat, folding his hands inside his sleeves. Across the hall, Clara stirred. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused. Her body registering the slight change in warmth, she shifted closer to June, who responded without waking fully. Their backs aligning again, the shared blanket sealed. Their breathing slowed. Margaret Hawthorne woke as well, though she would not have called it waking. She opened her eyes, noted the shape of the darkness, and closed them again. Her body adjusted slightly, drawing one arm closer to her chest. Willow shifted inside the curtain, pressed nearer, and purred once. A short, soft vibration that settled both of them. Margaret had learned long ago that sleep did not belong to the night alone. It belonged to the spaces between waking. Those intervals were not failures of rest. They were part of it. Sarah Hawthorne surfaced briefly, her awareness sharpening just enough to assess. She felt the air within her enclosure, the warmth still present, the cold held at bay. She sensed the fire's subtle renewal without seeing it. She adjusted the opening at the top of her curtain by a finger's width, improving circulation without losing heat. Then she let go again. Outside the keep, the night continued its long work. Snow fell lightly, accumulating where no one would clear it until morning. The town below lay silent, its own households navigating similar rhythms of waking and rest. Inside, time moved by sensation alone. Ethan woke once more. Later, his body heavy but alert enough to recognize that something had changed again. The air felt colder now, despite the layers. This was the hour Thomas Reed had spoken of earlier. The point when the stone released what it had taken during the day. Ethan pulled his knees tighter, instinctively conserving heat. Rusty adjusted as well, pressing closer. His warmth steady, but not excessive. Ethan's hand rested against the dog's shoulder, feeling the slow movement of breath beneath fur. That contact anchored him. He did not open his eyes this time. Sleep returned. Not deep, but sufficient. The night did not require more. By the time the coals settled again, and the hall's breathing synchronized once more, the keep had reached the farthest edge of darkness. The broken pieces of sleep had added up, not to comfort, but to survival, and so the night held, patient and unbroken in its own way, while those within it rested as they could. The night reached its deepest point without warning. There was no sound to announce it, no visible change in the dark beyond the windows. It arrived as a feeling first, a tightening, a subtle withdrawal of warmth that had been carefully held through the earlier hours. This was the part of the night everyone knew, even if no one spoke of it aloud. The longest stretch, the coldest edge. Inside Hawthorne Keep, the stone released what it had been holding. The cold did not rush. It seeped. It rose slowly from the floor, pressed gently through the walls, and thinned the fragile pockets of warmth that people had built around themselves. Breath became more visible now, faint clouds forming and fading within curtained spaces. Each exhale marked the air briefly before vanishing, leaving behind the quiet proof that the night had reached its peak. Ethan stirred. He did not wake fully, but his body recognized the change immediately. His knees drew closer to his chest, reducing the space where heat could escape. Rusty adjusted with him, pressing tighter along Ethan's legs, his old body instinctively responding. The dog's breath warmed the enclosed air near the floor, slow and steady, creating a narrow band of comfort where it mattered most. The curtain near Ethan's face moved slightly with each breath. The fabric stiffened in places now. Moisture from earlier hours had cooled, forming a thin, almost imperceptible layer of frost where warmth met cold. The boundary between inside and outside had sharpened. Across the hall, Clara and June shifted closer again, though neither fully woke. Clara's arm draped more firmly over her sister's shoulder, anchoring them together. Their shared blanket tightened, sealing in what warmth remained. This was not a conscious act. It was learned behavior, repeated through nights like this one. Sarah Hawthorne surfaced briefly from sleep, awareness cutting through the fog just long enough to assess. The cold touched her face more sharply now. She adjusted her posture, angling herself closer to the inner side of her frame. Her movements were minimal. Any excess motion wasted heat. She felt the fabric of her cloak tighten around her shoulders and allowed it to remain that way. She did not feel alarm. This hour was expected. Margaret Hawthorne woke more fully. Her eyes opened in the darkness, and she knew immediately where she was in the night. Years had trained her body to recognize this moment. The air felt thinner, the cold sharper, the keep quieter, as if even the stone were holding its breath. She turned her head slightly, listening. Beyond her own curtain, she could hear the soft, uneven rhythm of Ethan's breathing. It was slower than earlier, deeper, but there was a faint tremor there, a sign of the cold's persistence. Margaret did not call out. She did not sit up abruptly. She moved the way one did when sound mattered. Carefully, she slipped one arm free from her layers and reached across the narrow space. Her hand found the edge of an extra blanket folded nearby. She drew it toward her, lifted the curtain just enough to slide her arm through, and extended the fabric over Ethan's legs and lower back. Ethan did not wake. The added weight settled. Trapping warmth more effectively, Rusty shifted once, accommodating the change, then stilled again. Margaret withdrew her hand and let the curtain fall back into place, sealing the space as it had been. She lay still for a moment afterward, listening again. Satisfied, she closed her eyes. Near the hearth, Samuel Brooks stood quietly. This was the hour he had prepared for. The coals glowed faintly now, their color deep and steady. The small piece of wood he had added earlier had done its work. Heat radiated outward just enough to slow the cold's advance, not enough to push it back. Samuel knew better than to fight the night at this stage. His task was maintenance, not resistance. He rubbed his hands together once, then tucked them back into his sleeves. His breath showed briefly in front of his face before dissipating. He did not add more wood. The reserved bundle remained untouched, waiting for the moment just before morning when it would matter most. Willow lifted her head inside Margaret's curtain, eyes briefly opening. The temperature shift reached her too. She rose, turned once, and pressed closer to Margaret's side, finding the warmest point. Her purr returned, faint but persistent, vibrating through fabric and bone alike. The wind outside found its way through the same old seams, but it sounded different now. Lower, less insistent. It had done most of its work already. Snow continued to fall lightly, settling deeper against the outer walls, insulating even as it chilled. Inside the keep, bodies drew inward across the hall. Those who slept alone moved closer to walls or furniture that held a trace of warmth. Those already sharing space tightened their arrangement further. No one sought distance. Distance belonged to daylight. Ethan drifted closer to waking again. Though his eyes remained closed, he felt the weight of the new blanket, the warmth along his back. His body relaxed slightly in response. He did not know who had placed it there. He did not need to. Sleep returned in shallow waves. This was not rest meant to refresh. It was rest meant to endure. The keep held steady through the coldest hours. Stone and fabric and bodies working together without coordination, without instruction. Each small adjustment mattered. Each shared inch of warmth counted, and slowly, imperceptibly, the night began to release its grip. Morning did not arrive with light at first. It arrived with change. The coal loosened its hold gradually, retreating in the same patient way it had advanced. The air inside Hawthorne Keep remained cold, but no longer sharp. Breath still showed faintly, yet it faded more quickly now, dissolving before it could linger. Somewhere deep within the stone, the night's long work was ending. Samuel Brooks felt it before he saw it. He rose from his stool, joints stiff but responsive, and moved toward the hearth with deliberate care. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Not because it was dramatic, but because it mattered. He reached for the reserved bundle of firewood, the one that had remained untouched all night. The twine came loose easily beneath his fingers. He added 2 small pieces to the coals, arranging them so they would catch cleanly. The embers responded almost at once, brightening, feeding on the stored heat rather than demanding much of their own. Flame returned, modest but steady, its warmth reaching farther than it had in hours. No one stirred at first. The fire was not meant to wake them. It was meant to greet them when they did. Ethan woke slowly, the way one surfaced from deep water. Not abruptly, but with a gentle awareness of his surroundings. His first sensation was warmth, unexpected and welcome. His legs were still heavy beneath layers of fabric, but they no longer felt numb. Rusty lay pressed against him, unchanged, his breathing slow and even. Ethan smiled. It was small, unconscious at first, then fuller as he realized Rusty had not moved all night. The dog's ears twitched once as Ethan shifted, but his eyes remained closed. There was a peace in that stillness, a reassurance that nothing had gone wrong while sleep held the room. Ethan reached down and rested his hand against Rusty's shoulder. The warmth there felt earned. Across the hall, Anna Miller stirred and sat up slowly. She pushed the curtain aside and drew a breath that felt different than it had hours earlier. The air still carried winter's weight, but there was something else beneath it. A hint of relief, subtle but unmistakable. She looked around the hall, taking it in. People were still asleep, but their postures had loosened. Bodies lay less tightly curled. Blankets rested more naturally, no longer pulled to their limits. The fire's glow reached farther now, softening the stone and lifting shadows. Hannah realized then that the room felt warmer, not because the fire burned brighter alone, but because it had not been fighting the cold by itself. The warmth of bodies, shared through the night, had altered the space. It was slight, barely measurable, but it was there. She exhaled, a quiet sound of understanding. Margaret Hawthorne woke next, her eyes opening to the low light of dawn filtering faintly through narrow windows. Frost clung to the edges of the stone, where moisture had settled overnight, tracing pale lines along the walls and curtain edges. She reached out and touched the fabric near her hand. It was stiff with cold on the outside, but warm within. Margaret smiled faintly. She sat up carefully and looked across the hall, counting faces without counting names. Everyone was still there. No one had faltered in the night. "Good," she murmured, mostly to herself. She rose and crossed the hall with measured steps, mindful of sleepers. Near the hearth, Samuel was already drawing water from a covered pot, pouring it into a simple cup. He did not look up when she approached. Margaret took the cup from him without ceremony. The water was warm, not hot, but enough to chase the stiffness from fingers and throat. She pressed it briefly to her palms before handing it back. Samuel nodded once. No praise was offered. None was needed. The warmth of the water was acknowledgement enough. Clara and June stirred together, blinking in unison as the firelight brightened. Clara stretched carefully, testing limbs before moving fully. June followed, rubbing warmth back into her hands. They exchanged a brief look. Tired, satisfied, unspoken agreement passing between them. Willow emerged from beneath Margaret's curtain, stretching her slender body before hopping lightly to the floor. She shook once, fur catching the light, then moved toward the hearth, choosing a new patch of warmth for the morning. Sarah Hawthorne sat up within her frame, her movements precise as ever. She drew the curtain aside and assessed the hall with the same calm attention she had carried through the night. Frost remained on the walls. The stone was still cold to the touch. Winter had not ended, but the night had been endured. She caught Margaret's eye across the room. Margaret inclined her head slightly and spoke so softly it barely carried. "We did it again." Sarah nodded. That was enough. Ethan sat up fully now, pushing his wool cap back and blinking toward the fire. He felt lighter than he had expected. Not rested exactly, but intact. Rusty opened one eye, then the other, before lifting his head and yawning deeply. Ethan laughed. A quiet sound, surprised but real. Outside, dawn continued its slow arrival, pale light brushing the upper stones of Hawthorne Keep and the snow-covered town below. Chimneys would soon begin to smoke again. Doors would open. The day would widen. Inside, the fire held steady. People rose slowly, stretching warmth back into their bodies, gathering layers without haste. There was no announcement of success, no declaration of triumph. There never was. There was only the simple knowledge that the night had passed. No victory, no miracle. Just one more winter night endured. Together, the night inside Hawthorne Keep was not defeated. It was endured. And that is the quiet lesson this story leaves with us. In life, many difficulties do not disappear simply because we wish them away. Cold seasons arrive. Long nights come. Circumstances narrow what we can do and test what we can carry. Most of the time, there is no miracle waiting just before dawn. What carries us through is something simpler. Routine, patience, preparation, and the willingness to stay close to others instead of facing hardship alone. The people in this story did not overcome winter through strength or pride. They survived by adjusting, sharing warmth, and doing small, ordinary things correctly. Night after night, they trusted that even when comfort was limited, Consistency and care could be enough. In our own lives, the challenges may look different, but the lesson remains the same. When times are difficult, focus on what you can control. Take care of small details. Be patient with yourself. Stay close to those who bring warmth into your life. And remember that enduring one hard night is already a victory. If this story brought you calm, reflection, or comfort, consider how you might apply its lesson today. Perhaps by resting when you need to. Perhaps by reaching out to someone quietly. Perhaps by preparing yourself gently for the challenges ahead, instead of fearing them. If you found value in this story, please share it with someone who may need peace tonight. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from and what part of the story stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel to continue these quiet journeys together. And if you believe, may God bless you, protect you, and give you strength through every long night you face. If this story spoke to you, feel free to comment Amen. Thank you for listening.